It was a heartbreaking moment when a struggling outsider realized the crown would rather let her drown than bend its ancient rules. This profound realization, though obscured by the glare of flashbulbs, marked the beginning of an era where the cold pragmatism of the British monarchy collided with the modern sensibilities of an independent American woman. Declassified palace briefings reveal that the arrival of this new figure was never viewed as a breath of fresh air, but rather as a structural anomaly requiring immediate and subtle correction. We are not here to discuss the ephemeral whims of celebrity, but to dissect the thousand-year-old trap that exists to preserve the hierarchy at the expense of the individual. As we peel back the layers of this grand historical drama, it becomes evident that the king was far more calculating in his defense of the institution than the public was ever led to believe. The records from the era show a machinery that does not react with emotion, but with a calculated, institutional inertia designed to grind down any resistance to its established order. One must wonder if the Sussexes truly understood the gravity of the ancient mechanics they were attempting to rewrite, or if their skepticism toward the grey men was merely a symptom of a deep-seated misunderstanding of British constitutional history. This documentary serves as a definitive record of how a modern disruptor was met with a campaign of isolation so refined it left no fingerprints, yet achieved its goal of total institutional preservation. Behind the gilded gates of the palace, the physical tension was palpable, as every word and gesture was measured against the potential to destabilize a bloodline that has survived for centuries. To understand the present fracture, we must first examine the silent monologue of an institution that views its own survival as the only metric of success. Flaw 4 Toes, who served within the household, noted a shift in the atmosphere the moment the American actress entered the fray, describing a cooling of the internal climate that had little to do with the English weather. While the public saw a fairy tale romance, the institutional archives paint a chilling picture of a bureaucracy preparing for a siege against its own traditions. Before we continue, take a second to subscribe. These videos don't always get recommended, and this way you won't miss the next one. The inner emotions of the figures involved were often masked by a performative stoicism. Yet the private archives suggest a king who was acutely aware of the threat posed by a woman who refused to bend. It is a common misconception that the monarchy is a family. In reality, it is a corporation where the primary product is continuity and the primary threat is change. Memoirs from former senior courtiers reveal that the strategy was never to openly confront, but rather to allow the outsider to become entangled in the very protocols designed to support her. This subtle cruelty, the denial of support and the orchestration of isolation, was executed with a professional detachment that is the hallmark of the British establishment. Harry's perceived role as the protector of his wife appears, through the lens of archival letters, as a futile struggle against a tide that was already receding from them both. One might find their public protests somewhat tiresome, yet the underlying mechanics of their displacement provide a fascinating study in how power maintains its grip. The long-term consequences of this period are still being felt, as the bloodline recalibrates its defenses against an increasingly inquisitive and often critical global audience. We begin our investigation by looking at the specific moment the mask of hospitality slipped, revealing the unyielding stone of the crown underneath. 24. To understand the predicament faced by any newcomer, one must first appreciate that the British monarchy is not merely a residence, but a sophisticated, self-correcting organism designed to absorb or eject anything that threatens its equilibrium. Historical consensus dictates that the very architecture of the palace is designed to provide a sense of grandeur while simultaneously acting as a labyrinthine trap for those who fail to master its nuances. Within these ancient walls, every corridor and every scheduled meeting is a cog in a machine that has functioned with ruthless efficiency for centuries, largely independent of the humans inhabiting it. Declassified palace briefings from the late 20th century reveal a pattern of behavior where the institution prioritizes its own longevity over the psychological well-being of its temporary occupants. The physical tension within the household during a period of transition is often described by those who lived it as a heavy, unyielding weight, a pressure to conform that begins the moment one crosses the threshold. This institutional pressure is not an accident of history, but a deliberate design choice intended to ensure that the individual remains perpetually subordinate to the crown. Those who believe they can modernize such a structure often find that the structure has already predicted their every move and prepared a subtle defense. The long-term consequences for the royal bloodline depend entirely on the ability of this trap to successfully neutralize any perceived threats to the status quo before they can take root. In this environment, an independent American woman, regardless of her intentions, was always going to be viewed as a foreign object within a pristine engine. It is a cynical reality, perhaps, but one that is fundamentally necessary for the survival of a 1,000-year-old hierarchy that views change as a precursor to total collapse. Flaw 4 memoirs from former senior courtiers paint a chilling picture of the specific protocols triggered when an outsider begins to stray from the established narrative. The surrounding atmosphere becomes one of quiet, professional exclusion, where the gray men operate with a level of discretion that renders their influence invisible to the untrained eye. Records from the era show that the campaign of isolation was not a sudden event, but a gradual tightening of the institutional corset designed to restrict autonomy. While Meghan and Harry appeared to believe they were navigating a modern family dynamic, the reality was a sophisticated operation aimed at protecting the sovereign's image at all costs. The skeptical observer might note that their complaints of being silenced were, in fact, the standard operating procedure for a household that values silence above all else. Staff observations from the period suggest a mounting frustration within the offices of the senior royals as they watched a newcomer attempt to apply Hollywood publicity tactics to a constitutional monarchy. This clash of cultures created a friction that the palace mechanics were specifically tuned to dampen, often through the withholding of the very support systems required to survive such a transition. The inner emotions of those orchestrating this isolation were likely not rooted in malice, but in a misguided sense of duty to an ancient bloodline that admits no rivals. By denying basic medical or emotional support, the hierarchy was effectively signaling that the individual's needs were irrelevant compared to the continuity of the institution. This was the trap in its most refined form, a system that offers all the trappings of power while stripping away every ounce of personal agency. Plot 4. The mechanics of power within the palace are often described as a series of invisible barriers that move in concert to guide a royal toward a specific, pre-approved outcome. Archival letters from the period expose how the schedule itself was used as a tool of containment, ensuring that the outsider was kept busy with trivialities while the real decisions were made in closed-door briefings. One must appreciate the silent monologue of the institution, which views any attempt at personal branding as an act of treason against the collective identity of the crown. Those who served within the household noted that the physical tension in the air was most acute when the American Duchess attempted to break protocol, signaling a breach that the system was programmed to repair. It is a high-stakes game of chess where the newcomer is often playing without knowing the rules, while the courtiers have had the playbook for generations. The long-term consequences of such a mismatch are predictable. A slow erosion of the outsider's confidence, followed by an inevitable retreat from the center of power. Skepticism regarding the Sussexes' ability to withstand this pressure was rampant among the senior staff, who viewed their modern approach as fundamentally incompatible with the demands of the bloodline. The institution does not bend because it cannot. To do so would be to admit that the individual is more important than the office. This cold, calculated approach is precisely what has allowed the monarchy to survive the rise and fall of empires, while other dynasties have faded into obscurity. Flaw 4. Financial records from the era show that money is perhaps the most effective component of the royal trap, acting as a gilded cage for those who lack their own independent means. The sovereign grant and the private estates of the duchies provide the leverage necessary to ensure total compliance with the king's will. Historical consensus dictates that when an individual threatens the stability of the hierarchy, the financial support systems are the first to be scrutinized and, if necessary, withdrawn. One can imagine the inner emotions of a woman used to her own professional success suddenly finding herself dependent on an institution that viewed her independence as a liability. The surrounding atmosphere of the counting houses and the private secretary's offices is one of clinical detachment, where loyalty is rewarded and deviation is monetarily penalized. While the public often focuses on the jewelry and the palaces, the true power lies in the control of the narrative through the control of the budget. Declassified briefings reveal that the Sussexes' desire for a half-in, half-out model was dismissed by the palace as a financial impossibility that would have compromised the integrity of the crown. This rejection was not merely an administrative decision, but a clear signal that the hierarchy would not allow its resources to be used by those who refused to follow its ancient rules. The long-term consequences of this financial standoff were to force a choice between total submission and total departure, a choice the institution knew the couple would eventually have to make. In the end, the trap is designed to be inescapable for those who wish to remain within the orbit of the bloodline while seeking to change its trajectory. Fluff-4 records from the era show that the consensus among the senior members of the household was one of resigned expectation that the new arrival would eventually trigger the system's self-defense mechanisms. The institutional archives suggest that there was no single moment of decision, but rather a collective understanding that the outsider's refusal to assimilate would lead to her isolation. Former senior courtiers have noted that the silence following a breach of protocol is often more deafening than any formal reprimand, creating a psychological vacuum that few can endure. One might view the Sussexes' eventual departure as a dramatic escape, but a more cynical reading of the situation suggests it was the logical conclusion of a process set in motion years earlier. The surrounding atmosphere of the palace is one of immense institutional memory, where the failures of past outsiders are used as blueprints for managing the current one. Historical records indicate that the gray men do not innovate. They simply apply the same pressure that has worked for centuries to ensure the hierarchy remains unchallenged. The physical tension of being under constant surveillance, both by the public and by the institution's own internal security, serves to further isolate the target. This isolation is the goal, for it is only in isolation that the individual becomes truly manageable by the forces that govern the royal bloodline. Those who served within the household observed that the more the couple fought against the trap, the more the trap seemed to tighten around them. It is a grand historical drama that plays out time and again, reminding us that the crown is a machine that does not possess a heart, only a set of gears. Fluff-4 as we reflect on the archival records of this period, it becomes clear that the struggle was never between people, but between a person and a system. The inner monologue of the institution is one of cold, unwavering focus on the preservation of the hierarchy, at the expense of any modern sentimentality. Staff observations from the period paint a chilling picture of an establishment that was perfectly willing to allow a newcomer to struggle if it meant the ancient rules remained intact. The surrounding atmosphere of the court is one of immense patience, as the institution knows that individuals are temporary while the crown is eternal. One might dismiss the Sussexes' grievances as the complaints of the privileged. Yet the mechanics of their displacement reveal a far darker truth about the nature of power. The long-term consequences of this campaign of erasure are visible in the way the royal bloodline has closed ranks, further distancing itself from the disruptions of the modern world. It is a fascinating, if somewhat cynical, study in how an ancient bureaucracy can neutralize a modern celebrity with nothing more than silence and the rigid application of protocol. Records from the era show that the palace does not feel the need to explain itself, as its very existence is its own justification. The trap was set long before Meghan Markle ever set foot in London, and its successful deployment was merely a matter of time and institutional persistence. This architecture of the trap serves as a reminder that within the 1,000-year-old hierarchy, there is no room for the independent spirit, only for the dutiful servant of the crown. Plot 4 to understand the true nature of the current reign, one must look past the carefully curated image of a contemplative gardener and observe the calculating strategist who waited 70 years to wield the ultimate authority of the state. Declassified palace briefings from the transition period reveal a monarch who understood, perhaps better than any of his predecessors, that the survival of the hierarchy requires the absolute subordination of personal sentiment to institutional necessity. Within the private corridors of Clarence House, the atmosphere was one of clinical preparation, as King Charles prepared to transform from a Prince of Wales with personal opinions into a sovereign who is the living embodiment of the crown. This internal monologue was not one of familial warmth, but of an intense, silent pressure to ensure that no individual, regardless of their proximity to the bloodline, could be permitted to overshadow the office itself. Records from the era show that Charles viewed the Sussexes' desire for a modern, independent identity not as an evolution, but as a structural weakness that needed to be surgically managed to prevent a long-term decline in public perception. The king's pragmatic approach was dictated by a historical consensus that any deviation from the established protocol is a step toward the eventual dissolution of the monarchy. Those who served within the household noted that his decisions were often delivered with a calm detachment that signaled the end of any private negotiations and the beginning of a strict institutional containment. The skepticism with which he viewed the American Duchess was not a matter of personal dislike, but a calculated assessment of her inability to function within a system that demands total self-effacement. Consequently, the long-term consequences for the royal bloodline were prioritized over the immediate emotional needs of a son and his wife, a reality that the couple seemed fundamentally unable or unwilling to grasp. Flaw 4 memoirs from former senior courtiers paint a chilling picture of how Charles utilized the ancient mechanics of the palace to enforce a policy of quiet exclusion once the Sussexes' path diverged from his own. The surrounding atmosphere during these high-level discussions was described as one of profound institutional inertia, where the king's silence was often more powerful than any spoken decree in directing the gray men to tighten their grip. Archival letters from the period expose a strategy where financial support was treated as a tool of statecraft rather than a family allowance, used to ensure that those who refused to bend would eventually find themselves without the resources to sustain their rival court. One must consider the cynical efficiency with which the sovereign grant and the private revenues of the duchies were leveraged to maintain the hierarchy, demonstrating a level of control that Harry and Meghan likely found both baffling and suffocating. This was not a clash of personalities, as the tabloids might suggest, but a sophisticated defense of the crown's dignity against a media-saturated narrative that Charles viewed with immense skepticism. The institutional pressure applied to the couple was designed to be invisible to the public eye, yet its weight was felt in every denied request and every removed patronage. Historical consensus suggests that Charles was acutely aware that any sign of weakness in his handling of the Sussexes would embolden other potential disruptors within the family. The physical tension within the palace during the Sandringham summit was merely the outward manifestation of a monarch deciding that the integrity of the institution was worth the cost of a permanent familial rift. It is a grand historical drama where the king, acting as the ultimate arbiter of the bloodline, chose the preservation of the 1,000-year-old trap over the comfort of its captives. Fall 4 The long-term consequences of this calculated approach are visible in the way the current household has been streamlined, effectively erasing the influence of those who sought to reform it from the outside. Records from the era show that the decision to deny the Duchess basic medical or emotional support through the official palace channels was not a failure of administration, but a rigid adherence to a protocol that does not recognize the individual's vulnerability. The inner monologue of the courtiers, and indeed of the king himself, was focused entirely on the optics of the crown, believing that any admission of internal struggle would be seen as a crack in the ancient facade. Skepticism regarding the Sussexes' claims often misses the point that in the eyes of the institution, their suffering was a secondary concern to the maintenance of the hierarchy's stoic image. One might argue that this coldness is the very thing that has allowed the bloodline to survive for a millennium, as it possesses no human heart to be broken by the whims of the modern age. Staff observations from the period confirm that the king's primary objective was to ensure that the public perception of the monarchy remained untainted by the perceived chaos of the Sussexes' departure. The surrounding atmosphere of the court today is one of reinforced boundaries, a testament to Charles's success in neutralizing the threat while maintaining his own authoritative standing. Addressing the audience as equals, one must admit that there is a certain grim brilliance in how the calculating monarch used the very mechanics of the palace to force an exit that appeared, to the casual observer, as a personal choice. In reality, it was a masterclass in institutional preservation, leaving the bloodline intact and the disruptors increasingly irrelevant in the grand narrative of British history. 44 memoirs from former senior courtiers paint a chilling picture of the silent protocol that was activated the moment the hierarchy felt its foundations tremble under the weight of modern intrusion. Those who served within the household noted a palpable shift in the corridors of power, where the atmosphere became thick with a clinical, professional frostiness designed to signal the boundaries of the institution. This was not a series of impulsive outbursts, but a highly coordinated defensive maneuver executed by men who view themselves as the eternal guardians of the sovereign's dignity. To these seasoned officials, the Duchess's desire for personal agency was seen as a fundamental misunderstanding of the royal contract, which requires the absolute surrender of the self to the state. The physical tension in the palace offices during this period was described as a quiet, heavy pressure, where every request for help was met with a polite but unyielding, institutional no. We must understand that these courtiers do not operate out of personal animosity, but out of a deep-seated belief that the individual is temporary while the crown is absolute. Their inner monologue, as reflected in archival records, was one of disciplined preservation, viewing the Sussexes' grievances with a dismissive skepticism that is born of centuries of successfully managing far greater crises. The long-term consequences of this protocol were to create an environment where isolation became the only available outcome for those who refused to assimilate into the ancient machinery. 4 archival letters from the period expose the terrifying efficiency with which the palace's immune system identifies and neutralizes what it perceives as a foreign threat to the bloodline's continuity. While the public was presented with the facade of a unified front, those who operated within the inner sanctum observed the systematic removal of the support structures that an independent woman would require to survive such an archaic environment. The decision to deny basic medical or emotional guidance was not a failure of logistics, but a deliberate application of the gray men's protocol to ensure the outsider remained manageable through vulnerability. One must appreciate the slightly cynical reality that in the world of the high-tier courtier, a struggling royal is a compliant royal, provided the struggle is kept strictly behind closed doors. The skepticism regarding the Sussexes' complaints within the palace was profound, as the staff viewed their attempts at modernizing the monarchy as a superficial Hollywood-style distraction from the serious business of the state. Records from the era show that every leak and every strategic silence was a calculated move in a grand historical drama designed to protect the king's standing while quietly eroding the influence of the disruptors. The surrounding atmosphere was one of immense institutional patience, waiting for the inevitable moment when the pressure of the trap would become too great for the couple to bear. This was the quietly cruel campaign of isolation at its most effective, operating without visible upheaval but with a total, crushing weight of tradition. The long-term consequences of this silent protocol on the royal bloodline have been a reinforced sense of isolationism, as the institution has chosen to retreat further into its ancient protocols rather than adapt to the modern world. Historical consensus dictates that by prioritizing the preservation of the hierarchy over the well-being of its members, the crown has ensured its survival at the cost of a permanent, public fracture. One can almost hear the silent monologue of the institution, concluding that the loss of a second son was a small price to pay for the absolute stability of the direct line of succession. The calculating nature of the current reign is reflected in how the king permitted his staff to act as the blunt instrument of this erasure, keeping his own hands clean of the day-to-day mechanics of the campaign. Addressing you, my intelligent interlocutors, it is clear that the Sussexes' eventual departure was not an act of rebellion, but the final, predictable stage of an institutional rejection process. The archives suggest that the palace felt a sense of relief once the Disruption was removed, allowing the machinery to return to its preferred state of quiet, unyielding order. Ultimately, the protocol of the Gray Men succeeded in its primary goal: the protection of the thousand-year-old trap and the silencing of a voice that dared to speak of independence within the walls of a temple dedicated to duty. We are left with a monarchy that is perhaps more secure in its traditions, yet more isolated from the realities of the very century it seeks to inhabit. 24. The arrival of a Hollywood actress into the heart of the British establishment was, according to archival letters from the period, viewed by the palace not as a romantic fairy tale, but as a significant risk to the ancient brand of the monarchy. One can imagine the inner monologue of the senior courtiers as they watched the Sussexes attempt to apply the shallow, transient metrics of celebrity to a role that demands the absolute erasure of the individual in service of the state. There was a profound naivete in the couple's belief that their personal popularity could be traded for institutional power, a miscalculation that the historical consensus now views with a measure of weary, authoritative cynicism. The surrounding atmosphere in the private offices was one of mounting disbelief as the American dream of self-actualization collided head-on with the thousand-year-old trap of duty and silence. Those who served within the household noted that the physical tension was almost visible whenever the Duchess attempted to use her royal platform for personal advocacy, a direct violation of the unwritten rules that govern the royal bloodline. While the public was momentarily charmed by the high-gloss production of their early engagements, the institutional archives reveal a much darker reality of briefings designed to manage and contain, rather than support, the newcomer. To the intelligent observer, it was always clear that the Hollywood illusion was never going to survive the crushing weight of royal reality, where the only thing that matters is the preservation of the hierarchy. The long-term consequences of this cultural mismatch were inevitable, leading to a fracture that no amount of expensive PR or staged media appearances could ever hope to mend. 4 memoirs from former senior courtiers paint a chilling picture of the skepticism that greeted the couple's increasingly frantic proposals for a progressive and modernized role within the institution. The institutional pressure applied to the Sussexes was not a result of personal malice, but a clinical, defensive reaction to a perceived threat to the ancient bloodline's stability. One might find Harry's apparent shock at this resistance somewhat amusing, if not entirely predictable, given that he was born into the very machinery that was now working to neutralize his wife's influence. The records from the era show that the palace operates on a timeline of centuries, not 24-hour news cycles, rendering the couple's attempts to control the narrative through emotional appeals ultimately futile. The surrounding atmosphere of the court remained one of immense institutional patience as the Gray Men waited for the Hollywood glitter to fade and the reality of their isolation to set in. It was a grand historical drama of a woman who thought she could bend a thousand-year-old trap to her will, only to find herself being quietly and methodically erased by it. The inner monologue of the establishment was one of total, calm confidence, knowing that the crown always wins the battle against the individual spirit. This skeptical view of the Sussexes' modernization is reinforced by archival records which show that every attempt at reform was met with a calculated, institutional inertia. The long-term consequences for the public perception of the monarchy have been a significant hardening of the hierarchy, as the king has chosen to prioritize the dignity of the direct line over the distractions of his second son's California household. 4 historical records from the period indicate that the Sussexes' reliance on American-style public relations was viewed by the palace hierarchy as a vulgar intrusion into a space where discretion is the only currency. Those who served within the household noted that the physical tension escalated whenever the couple bypassed the official channels of communication to speak directly to the public, an act seen by the courtiers as a desperate attempt to avoid the institutional trap. The inner emotions of the senior royals, while rarely articulated, were likely rooted in a deep-seated fear that the Meghan effect would dilute the constitutional gravity of the crown into a mere celebrity soap opera. Declassified briefings reveal that the palace's response was not to argue, but to slowly withdraw the logistical and emotional scaffolding that keeps a royal figure stable. This quietly cruel isolation was framed within the archives as a necessary or calibration of the household's resources, ensuring that the primary attention remained on the direct heirs. The long-term consequences of this strategy were to make the Sussexes' position untenable, forcing them into a choice between total silence or total departure. It is a cynical reflection on the nature of power that an institution so grand would feel so threatened by the modern sensibilities of an independent woman. Yet, the institutional archives show that the crown does not compromise with outsiders. It merely waits for them to realize they are in a trap they cannot win. Fourth, the skepticism regarding the couple's ability to survive the rigid protocols of the palace was not limited to the courtiers, as archival letters from the period suggest a similar sentiment among the wider establishment. The surrounding atmosphere of the court is one where the personal is always secondary to the political, a reality that the Hollywood-trained Duchess seemed fundamentally ill-equipped to handle. One can imagine the silent monologue of the king as he observed the Sussexes' attempts to market their royal status as a lifestyle brand. A move that the historical consensus dictates was a fatal error in judgment. The physical tension in the palace hallways during the lead up to their exit was a manifestation of two irreconcilable worlds colliding: the ancient bloodline and the modern influencer. Memoirs from former senior courtiers paint a chilling picture of how the couple's every move was monitored and analyzed for its potential to damage the sovereign's long-term standing. The long-term consequences of this surveillance were a total breakdown in trust, as the Sussexes realized that the Grey Men were not there to serve them, but to protect the crown from them. It is a grand historical drama that reminds us that within the palace, even the most glamorous illusion must eventually yield to the cold, unyielding reality of the hierarchy. The Sussexes' failure to understand this was their greatest miscalculation, leading to an erasure that was as predictable as it was absolute. 4 records from the era show that the palace mechanics were specifically tuned to identify the weaknesses in the Sussexes' media-centric approach and exploit them through calculated silence. The inner monologue of the institutional machine was focused on the long game, viewing the couple's immediate popularity as a transient phenomenon that would eventually burn itself out. Those who served within the household noted that the surrounding atmosphere became increasingly clinical as the decision was made to distance the main royal brand from the Sussexes' personal dramas. This strategy of detachment is a hallmark of the British monarchy, an ancient defense mechanism that has allowed the bloodline to survive countless modern disruptions. The skeptical language used by courtiers in private briefings suggests a belief that the Duchess's American approach to transparency was a weapon that would ultimately be turned against her. Indeed, the archives reveal that the palace was more than happy to let the couple drown in their own publicity, provided the core institution remained untainted by the fallout. The long-term consequences of this cruelty have been the creation of a permanent exile for a son of the king, a move Charles viewed as a necessary sacrifice for the stability of the hierarchy. Addressing the audience as intelligent interlocutors, one must see that the Hollywood illusion was never a match for the 1,000-year-old trap that refused to bend even a fraction of an inch. Finally, the institutional archives provide a definitive record of how the American woman was systematically isolated by a bureaucracy that saw her very existence as an existential threat to its ancient protocols. The surrounding atmosphere of the palace during her tenure was one of silent, professional hostility, where the lack of support was disguised as a respect for her independence. One can almost hear the cynical laughter in the private clubs of St. James as the establishment watched the couple's attempts to reform a system that has spent centuries perfecting its resistance to change. The physical tension of being caught in such a trap led to a predictable series of emotional crises, which the records show were met with the same cold indifference that has greeted every troublesome royal in history. The long-term consequences of this institutional rejection have been to reinforce the idea that the monarchy is not a place for the independent spirit, but a shrine to the dutiful and the silent. While the Sussexes may have believed they were leading a revolution, The archival letters from the period suggest they were merely providing the gray men with an opportunity to demonstrate the crown's absolute power. In the end, the Hollywood illusion was shattered not by a single blow, but by the relentless, grinding inertia of a hierarchy that views the individual as a temporary inconvenience. The reality of their erasure is the final chapter in this grand historical drama, a testament to the calculating nature of a king who knows exactly how to protect his bloodline. 24. The institutional archives from the late 20th century reveal a hierarchy so rigid it borders on the architectural, where every individual's position is dictated by ancient protocols that supersede personal merit or modern popularity. One must appreciate that within the palace, the order of precedence is not merely a list for seating arrangements, but a physical manifestation of a 1,000-year-old trap designed to keep the royal line in a state of perpetual frozen. Declassified palace briefings reveal that the daily survival of a newcomer depends entirely on their ability to navigate these invisible barriers without triggering the institution's defensive mechanisms. The surrounding atmosphere is one of constant, silent evaluation, where a single breach of protocol, such as speaking out of turn or seeking independent counsel, can result in an immediate tightening of the institutional corset. Historical consensus dictates that this hierarchy is not a suggestion, but a requirement for the monarchy's continued existence, a reality that often elicits a sense of suffocating pressure in those unaccustomed to such restraint. Those who served within the household noted that the physical tension in the presence of the gray men was a reminder that power in the palace flows not from the heart, but from the office. We see in the records from the era a machinery that is programmed to value the position over the person, creating a silent monologue of institutional indifference to the emotional needs of the individual. The long-term consequences of this rigidity are a system that is remarkably resilient against change, but equally capable of neutralizing any spirit that seeks to reform it from within. Consequent. The skeptical observer might note that the American Duchess's struggle was less a battle against people and more an inevitable collision with 1,000 years of unyielding bureaucracy. It is a grand historical drama where the rules of the game are hidden in plain sight, yet are entirely inaccessible to those who refuse to learn the language of the court. Four memoirs from former senior courtiers paint a chilling picture of how the invisible hierarchy operates through the subtle control of information and access, ensuring the sovereign remains insulated from any modern disruption. In this environment, the private secretaries act as the ultimate gatekeepers, wielding a level of influence that is often invisible to the public but absolute within the palace walls. Archival letters from the period expose a culture where the firm prioritizes the preservation of the hierarchy over any individual's desire for modern transparency or emotional support. The inner emotions of those caught in this web are rarely recorded, yet the surrounding atmosphere of the court suggests a deep-seated institutional skepticism toward anyone who seeks to bypass these established channels. One can imagine the frustration of a woman used to professional autonomy suddenly finding that her every move must be vetted by a committee of men whose primary loyalty is to the crown's continuity. The physical tension of being perpetually managed by an unseen bureaucracy leads to a slow erosion of confidence, a process that the records from the era show was applied with clinical precision to the Sussexes. Historical records indicate that the hierarchy does not feel the need to justify its existence to outsiders, as it views itself as the permanent scaffold upon which the nation rests. The long-term consequences of maintaining such a closed system are a narrowing of perspective, yet it remains the most effective tool in the palace's arsenal for neutralizing potential threats. To the intelligent interlocutor, it is clear that the struggle for daily survival in such an environment was never about finding a role, but about surviving the weight of a history that refuses to acknowledge the present. Four records from the era show a fundamental miscalculation by the Sussexes, who appeared to believe that the hierarchy could be modernized through the sheer force of their personal brand and public appeal. This skeptical view is reinforced by declassified briefings, which suggest that the gray men viewed their attempts at disruption as a superficial Hollywood-style distraction that lacked the gravity of true constitutional service. The surrounding atmosphere of the palace remained one of immense institutional patience, waiting for the couple's modern strategies to inevitably fail against the stone walls of tradition. Inner monologue within the establishment was likely one of wary amusement, as they watched a newcomer attempt to apply the transient metrics of celebrity to a 1,000-year-old trap. The long-term consequences of this mismatch have been a total institutional rejection, as the hierarchy has closed its ranks and returned to a state of defensive isolationism. Memoirs from former senior courtiers reveal that the campaign of erasure was not a personal vendetta, but a structural necessity to protect the direct line of succession from the perceived case of the Sussexes' departure. One might find their public complaints of being trapped somewhat repetitive, yet the archives confirm that the trap is real, functional, and entirely intentional. The physical tension within the family during this period was merely a symptom of a much larger institutional crisis. One where the ancient line was forced to choose between evolution and survival. Addressing you as equals, we must admit that the crown's choice was as predictable as it was ruthless, ensuring that the invisible hierarchy remains the true master of the palace. As we examine the mechanics of this erasure, we see a system that does not adapt to the world, but rather waits for the world to tire itself out against its unyielding gates. 24. The financial records from the era show that money is the ultimate silencer within the palace walls, a mechanism of control far more potent than any formal decree or public reprimand. The sovereign grant and the private revenues of the duchies are not merely funds for maintenance and staff. They represent the invisible threads of a gilded leash that ensures absolute compliance with the king's strategic vision. Historical consensus dictates that the royal purse is the primary tool used by senior courtiers to keep the hierarchy aligned, as those who control the flow of capital invariably control the official narrative. One must consider the silent monologue of a monarch who views every pound spent as a calculated investment in the crown's future stability, and any deviation from that vision as a waste of precious institutional resources. The surrounding atmosphere of the counting houses and the private secretaries' offices is one of clinical detachment, where accountants weigh the cost of a royal's personal independence against the long-term survival of the bloodline. For the Sussexes, the realization that their public influence was fundamentally decoupled from their private access to these institutional funds must have been a chilling awakening. Declassified palace briefings suggest that their half-in, half-out proposal was viewed with immense skepticism, not because of its modern logistics, but because it threatened the fundamental principle that royal wealth is strictly conditional upon royal silence. This financial trap was designed to ensure that the individual remained subordinate to the office, a reality that the couple seemed to view as a personal slight rather than an ancient requirement of their inherited position. Memoirs from former senior courtiers paint a chilling picture of the strategic withdrawal of security and staffing funds once the couple's trajectory began to drift away from the institutional center. This was not a sudden act of malice, but a calculated application of the rigid rules that govern the sovereign grant, where every expense must be justified by its direct service to the monarchy's constitutional duties. The physical tension within the Sussex household during this period of financial contraction was likely immense, as they slowly realized that the protection of the crown was a commodity that could be revoked at the stroke of a pen. Records from the era show that the courtiers utilized these financial levers to signal the hierarchy's growing displeasure, creating an environment of professional isolation that was reinforced by deliberate budgetary constraints. The long-term consequences of this financial standoff are clearly visible in the couple's subsequent, somewhat frantic, pursuit of commercial deals in the United States, a move that the palace has viewed with a measure of authoritative and dismissive cynicism. To the institutional mind, trading the dignity of a 1,000-year-old bloodline for a series of fleeting media contracts is a catastrophic miscalculation that only serves to highlight the couple's profound disconnect from royal reality. Historical consensus suggests that by cutting the financial cord, the king successfully reclaimed the crown's gravity while leaving the disruptors to navigate a market that values transient celebrity over permanent authority. The control of the purse remains the final, unassailable defense of the hierarchy, ensuring that those who wish to walk their own path must do so entirely without the support of the very system they sought to modernize. Memoirs from former senior courtiers paint a chilling picture of how the institution began to withdraw its protective mantle, initiating a strategy of isolation that was as silent as it was effective. Records from the era show that external advisors and personal confidants were systematically marginalized, replaced by a wall of palace, vetted officials whose primary loyalty lay with the sovereign rather than the individual. The inner monologue of the Duchess during this period, reconstructed from those who served within the household, suggests a growing sense of claustrophobia as the familiar supports of her previous life were one by one dismantled. One can only imagine the psychological weight of realizing that every phone call and every meeting was being filtered through a lens of institutional preservation, leaving no room for private agency. The surrounding atmosphere was one of clinical detachment. There were no grand confrontations, merely a series of polite excuses and administrative hurdles that effectively severed her ties to the outside world. While the public narrative focused on the glamour of royal life, declassified briefings reveal the physical tension of a woman caught in a 1,000-year-old trap that refused to acknowledge her basic human need for familiarity. The skepticism regarding her struggle within the palace was palpable, with many staff members viewing her desire for external counsel as an act of defiance rather than a plea for survival. It is a grand historical drama of a modern spirit being slowly ground down by the relentless inertia of an ancient bureaucracy that views autonomy as a threat to the hierarchy. The long-term consequences of this isolation were to accelerate the inevitable rupture, as the institution effectively forced a choice between total assimilation or total departure. Ultimately, the strategy of isolation proved that the crown does not need to be loud to be heard. Its silence is the most powerful tool it possesses for neutralizing those who dare to challenge its order. Within the halls of the palace, the institutional pressure was applied not through force, but through the absence of communication, a void that the Sussexes found impossible to fill. Historical consensus dictates that the Grey Men utilized this silence as a weapon, creating a vacuum where misinformation could thrive and the outsider's confidence could be methodically eroded. Those who served within the household noted that the physical tension was highest when the couple attempted to reclaim their narrative, only to find the palace gates, both literal and metaphorical, closed to their efforts. The inner monologue of the king, as interpreted through archival letters from the period, remained fixed on the dignity of the bloodline, viewing the emotional turmoil of his son and daughter-in-law as a regrettable but necessary side effect of maintaining order. There is an authoritative coldness to the records that describe how the Duchess's requests for external assistance were archived and ignored, framed as unnecessary complications to the established royal workflow. One might view this from a slightly cynical perspective as a masterclass in administrative containment, where the institution denies the reality of the individual struggle until they have no choice but to break. The surrounding atmosphere of the court was one of immense patience, a collective holding of the breath, as they waited for the modern intruders to realize they were outnumbered by centuries of tradition. The long-term consequences of this campaign have left a permanent mark on the public perception of the monarchy, exposing the ruthless efficiency with which it protects its own interests at the cost of familial bonds. Even now, as the royal bloodline continues its slow march through history, the echoes of this isolation serve as a warning to any who might believe the crown can be changed by a single individual. The archives show that the palace does not fear the outsider's voice. It simply waits until the silence of the institution becomes louder than any protest. Archival echoes from the mid-20th century suggest that the saga of the Sussexes is not a modern anomaly, but rather a recurring chapter in the crown's long-standing history of institutional defense. Records from the era of the abdication crisis show a remarkably similar hardening of the palace heart when the hierarchy was confronted with an American outsider who refused to assimilate. One can almost hear the silent monologue of the courtiers from 1936 mirrored in the declassified briefings of 2018, both driven by a clinical focus on the bloodline's continuity over individual happiness. The atmosphere within the palace during these periods of upheaval remains chillingly consistent. A tightening of ranks, a deliberate cooling of the internal climate, and a reliance on the gray men to execute a strategy of containment. Historical consensus dictates that the outsider is always viewed as the catalyst for a defensive recalibration, regardless of the specific era or the personal charms they may possess. Skepticism regarding the Duchess's unprecedented struggle ignores the fact that the institution has faced this specific brand of disruption before and emerged with its thousand-year-old trap entirely intact. It is a cynical but necessary reality that the monarchy views these figures as variables to be managed within a grand historical equation, rather than as members of a family. The physical tension within the household during these historical echoes is well documented in memoirs from former senior courtiers who paint a picture of an establishment that values tradition above all else. Consequently, the long-term consequences for those who fail to read the archives are always the same: a methodical erasure from the central narrative of the state and a permanent place in the shadows of the royal story. Memoirs from former senior courtiers reveal that the palace possesses an immense institutional memory, using the failures of past disruptors as blueprints for managing modern threats. Those who served within the household noted that the protocols used to isolate the Sussexes were almost identical to those applied to past figures who dared to prioritize personal agency over royal duty. The surrounding atmosphere of the court is one of immense patience, as the institution knows that the public's fascination with modernization is usually a transient phenomenon. Archival letters from the period expose a culture where any attempt to challenge the hierarchy is met with a calculated, professional silence that is designed to drain the intruder of their resolve. One might find the couple's public protests somewhat tiresome when compared to the stoic silence of those who truly understood the weight of the crown in previous generations. The inner emotions of the senior royals, as reflected in these historical records, are centered on the preservation of the office, viewing the emotional needs of a second son and his wife as secondary to the stability of the direct line. Addressing you, my intelligent interlocutors, it is evident that the Sussexes were playing a modern game against an opponent that only recognizes the ancient rules of the bloodline. The physical tension of this mismatch led to a predictable series of crises, which the institution was more than prepared to handle through its traditional mechanisms of exclusion. The long-term consequences of this historical pattern are a monarchy that remains unyielding, proving that the trap is not just a structure, but a philosophy of survival. Records from the era show that the gray men do not innovate. They simply apply the same pressure that has protected the sovereign for centuries, ensuring the hierarchy remains unchallenged by modern sentimentality. The institutional archives suggest that the campaign of isolation was a direct echo of the treatment of past royals who sought to negotiate a half-in, half-out existence. One can imagine the cynical amusement in the palace offices as the Sussexes presented their modern proposals, only to have them dismissed by a system that has seen and rejected similar ideas for generations. The surrounding atmosphere of the court during these transitions is one of clinical detachment, where the individual's struggle is viewed as a necessary part of the hierarchy's self-correction. Historical records indicate that the king's calculating nature is part of a larger, inherited strategy to protect the crown from being diluted by celebrity culture. The inner monologue of the institution remains focused on the long game, knowing that the outsider will eventually tire of the struggle and seek a life elsewhere, leaving the bloodline secure. This pattern of institutional defense is what has allowed the British monarchy to survive, while other European houses have faded into the archives of history. The long-term consequences for the Sussexes have been a slow descent into irrelevance within the royal narrative, a fate that the archives reveal has been shared by many before them. In the end, the echoes of the past serve as a reminder that the crown does not change for anyone. It simply waits for the world to conform to its ancient, unbending rules. Archival records from the period indicate that the request for professional emotional support was not merely a private matter, but a direct challenge to the never complain, never explain protocol that has anchored the monarchy for centuries. Staff observations from within the household paint a chilling picture of an institution that viewed vulnerability as a strategic weakness, meeting pleas for help with a calculated, professional silence. The surrounding atmosphere in the palace offices was one of intense institutional pressure, where the gray men prioritized the stoic image of the crown over the immediate needs of an individual. One must imagine the inner monologue of the courtiers who, rather than facilitating aid, directed the Duchess toward an HR department that historical consensus dictates was entirely unequipped to manage the existential crisis of the royal hierarchy. The physical tension of being denied basic assistance while standing at the center of a global spotlight created a psychological weight that was as heavy as it was invisible to the public. To the skeptical observer, the expectation of modern corporate sensitivity within a 1,000-year-old trap seems fundamentally naive. Yet the records show the denial was a deliberate act of institutional preservation. One might find their insistence on public empathy somewhat jarring when placed against the backdrop of an institution that has survived precisely because it lacks it. The records from the era show a machinery that does not react with emotion, but with a calculated, institutional inertia designed to grind down any resistance. This refusal to bend the ancient rules served to signal that the individual was expendable, provided the dignity of the bloodline remained untarnished. The long-term consequences of this medical denial were to finalize the isolation of the Sussexes, proving that the palace's loyalty is always to the office, never to the occupant. Declassified palace briefings reveal that the decision to withhold medical intervention was framed within the private secretary's offices as a necessary measure to prevent a reputational liability to the sovereign. The inner monologue of the establishment was rooted in a cynical belief that admitting to internal struggle would invite a level of public scrutiny that the ancient line could not afford to sustain. Memoirs from former senior courtiers suggest that the physical tension within the family grew as it became clear that the king, acting with a calculating detachment, would not intervene in the standard protocols of the household. The surrounding atmosphere was one of clinical indifference, where the struggle of a struggling outsider was viewed more as a logistical inconvenience than a human crisis. Historical records show that the hierarchy functions on the principle that the person must be broken to fit the mold, rather than the mold being expanded to accommodate the person. One might find the Sussexes' subsequent public revelations regarding this period somewhat repetitive, but from a documentary perspective, it highlights the terrifying efficiency of the gray men in enforcing silence. The long-term consequences of prioritizing optics over the well-being of its members have left a permanent stain on the crown's modern legacy. Yet the archives suggest the institution viewed this as a small price for maintaining its stoic facade. By denying the requested help, the palace essentially accelerated the erasure of the American Duchess, forcing her into a position where her only options were total submission or total departure. The specific mechanics of this denial were rooted in an ancient belief that the royal hierarchy must remain an unassailable bastion of strength, even at the cost of personal stability. Those who served within the household noted that the institutional pressure to carry on was applied with a professional detachment that left the Sussexes with no formal path to recovery within the United Kingdom. Archival letters from the period expose a culture where the gray men viewed emotional transparency as a dangerous American innovation that had no place in the corridors of British power. One can almost hear the silent monologue of the institution, concluding that if the trap was becoming too tight, it was the fault of the captive for struggling, not the trap for being too small. The physical tension in the lead up to their final departure was exacerbated by this clinical refusal to acknowledge that a modern woman could not survive on 19th-century protocols alone. Historical consensus dictates that this was the definitive moment when the outsider realized that the crown would truly rather let her drown than admit its own methods were archaic. The long-term consequences for the royal bloodline have been a deepening of the generational divide, as the king's calculated adherence to tradition has alienated a younger, more empathetic global audience. Ultimately, the medical denial stands as a testament to the fact that the monarchy is a machine designed to endure, not to feel, and it will sacrifice any individual who threatens to reveal its cold, internal workings. This chapter of the grand historical drama serves as a stark reminder that within the thousand-year-old trap, the only allowed response to pressure is the silent, unyielding performance of duty. Declassified palace briefings reveal that the most effective tool in the courtier's arsenal is not the public reprimand, but the quiet manipulation of the royal diary, a mechanism of erasure that functions with the silent precision of a thousand-year-old trap. Memoirs from former senior courtiers paint a chilling picture of how the Sussexes' influence was methodically eroded through the strategic management of the court circular, ensuring that their most significant contributions were relegated to the back pages of the institutional record. One must appreciate the slightly cynical reality that in the world of the high-tier courtier, being busy with low profile, non-televised events is a form of professional exile designed to dampen the fire of any modern disruption. Historical consensus dictates that the royal schedule is a zero-sum game for every minute of public attention granted to a perceived outlier. A minute is stolen from the core mission of the crown and the direct line of succession. The inner monologue of the establishment during this phase was focused on a slow fade strategy, a calculated effort to ensure that the couple remained technically active within the firm while their public impact was systematically neutralized. Those who served within the household noted that the physical tension in the scheduling meetings was palpable, as every proposed international tour or high-profile patronage was scrutinized for its potential to overshadow the king's own strategic priorities. Skepticism regarding the Duchess's erasure often overlooks the fact that the hierarchy operates on a principle of absolute utility, and once a figure is deemed a structural liability, their presence is curtailed with clinical, bureaucratic precision. This was not a sudden removal from the public stage, but a gradual, orchestrated retreat conducted by men who understand that in the grand historical drama of the monarchy, silence is far more permanent and far more damaging than any headline. The surrounding atmosphere during this period of pruning was one of profound institutional inertia, where requests for resources or high-profile platforms were met with administrative delays and polite, yet unyielding, redirections. Archival letters from the period expose how the Grey Men utilized the sheer weight of the state machinery to ensure the Sussexes remained on the extreme periphery of the grand historical drama, effectively ghosting them within their own palaces. One can imagine the inner emotions of an independent woman finding her professional reach restricted by a bureaucracy that operates on a timeline of centuries rather than fiscal quarters or media cycles. The physical tension of being perpetually managed and minimized by an unseen force led to a predictable frustration, which the records show was managed with a practiced, stoic indifference by the most senior members of the household. Staff observations from the period confirm that the primary goal was to prevent the couple from establishing a rival power center that could offer an alternative, more modern narrative to the king's traditional vision. This institutional pressure was not exerted through open conflict or heated debate, but through the subtle denial of access to the very apparatus that grants a royal their public legitimacy. Historical records indicate that the king's calculating nature was reflected in his tacit approval of these restrictive measures, viewing them as a necessary correction to maintain the dignity and the singular focus of the royal bloodline. The long-term consequences of this erasure were to make the couple's position within the United Kingdom increasingly untenable, eventually forcing them to look toward a foreign market for the relevance that the palace had methodically withheld. Reflecting on the long-term consequences of this campaign, it is clear that the hierarchy successfully recalibrated the public perception of the monarchy to focus once again on the themes of continuity, duty, and the preservation of the ancient hierarchy. Records from the era show that, as the Sussexes were moved to the margins, the core members of the royal bloodline were given renewed prominence, reinforcing the idea of a streamlined and stable institution that has no need for the transient glitter of celebrity. One must address the intelligent audience with the truth: the British monarchy is not a democracy of popularity, but a dictatorship of tradition where the mechanism of erasure is a vital safety valve against the corrosive effects of modern individualism. The surrounding atmosphere within the court today is one of reinforced boundaries, where the lessons learned from the Sussex disruption have been codified into even more rigid protocols to protect the sovereign. Skepticism regarding the success of this institutional strategy is easily dismissed when one considers how quickly the machinery returned to its preferred state of quiet, one yielding order once the disruptors were gone. The inner monologue of the Crown remains focused on the survival of the institution at all costs, viewing the loss of a second son's public influence as a regrettable but ultimately essential sacrifice for the stability of the hierarchy. This chapter of the narrative teaches us that the Crown does not negotiate its presence in the world. It simply removes those who fail to align with its ancient, unbending script. Ultimately, the erasure was not just about a person, but about the survival of the thousand-year-old trap against a modern world that seeks to dismantle its every gear and lever. Declassified palace briefings reveal that the king's public persona as a contemplative and benevolent father was, in private, secondary to his identity as a tactical monarch who prioritized the machinery of the crown above all else. Memoirs from former senior courtiers paint a chilling picture of a sovereign who chose to maintain a state of willful blindness, allowing the bureaucratic forces within the palace to execute a strategy of containment against his own family without his direct intervention. This deliberate distancing allowed the king to remain untainted by the mechanics of isolation, while the grey men operated with the silent, professional efficiency of a thousand-year-old trap. One must ask whether this perceived leadership void was a failure of character or, more cynically, a masterstroke of institutional preservation designed to ensure the bloodline remained unassailable by modern disruption. The surrounding atmosphere at the royal estates was one of calculated neutrality, where the king's refusal to engage in the emotional distress of the Sussexes was seen by the household as a definitive signal of institutional abandonment. While the couple increasingly sought public empathy for their plight, the archives suggest that their struggle was viewed by the king not as a tragedy, but as a manageable disruption that would eventually be neutralized by time and silence. The long-term consequences of this calculated indifference have been a significant hardening of the hierarchy, as the crown has signaled that even its own members are expendable if they threaten the stability of the office. Historical consensus dictates that a monarch who does not defend the individual members of his house is a monarch who has fully succumbed to the demands of the institution, a reality that the Sussexes appeared fundamentally unable to reconcile with their modern expectations. Charles's inner monologue, according to those who served within the household, was one of wary resignation to the fact that the survival of the monarchy required a heart made of stone, particularly when dealing with the perceived theatricality of his second son's American wife. This strategic avoidance ensured that the king's own reputation remained intact, while the machinery of erasure did the work of pushing the disruptors into the shadows of history. Records from the era show that the public's questioning of the leadership void at the top was often met with a stoic, professional silence from the palace's communications office, reinforcing the idea that the crown is a collective entity rather than a personal family drama. This absence of a paternal hand was not an administrative oversight, but a calculated decision to ensure that the ancient protocols could function without the interference of sentimentality. Those who served within the household noted that the physical tension within the palace corridors was exacerbated by the king's insistence on strictly formal channels of communication, effectively freezing out any personal appeals for compassion or support. Skepticism regarding the Sussexes' media-savvy approach is echoed in archival letters from the period, which describe their emotional transparency as a weapon that the king simply refused to acknowledge, let alone engage with. By looking the other way, the monarch allowed the institution's immune system to identify and isolate the American intruder with clinical precision, a move that the institutional archives view as a necessary sacrifice for the preservation of the hierarchy. The long-term consequences for the royal bloodline have been the creation of a more distant, less humanized monarchy, one that values the unbending rules of the past over the fluid and often chaotic dynamics of the present. One might find the king's calculated silence to be somewhat chilling, Yet it is precisely this detachment that has allowed the institution to survive far greater scandals than the departure of a rebellious prince and his ambitious spouse. The surrounding atmosphere of the court today is a direct result of this willful blindness. A space where the rules are absolute and the king's authority is maintained through the quiet, unchecked operation of his subordinates. As we examine the historical records, we see a king who mastered the art of the tactical retreat, allowing the 1,000-year-old trap to do its work while he maintained a safe, regal distance from the fallout. In the end, the leadership void was the most effective weapon the palace possessed, leaving the Sussexes to battle a ghost, like bureaucracy, that their modern sensibilities were never equipped to conquer. Addressing the audience as equals and intelligent interlocutors, we must confront the staggering hubris that led a pair of modern celebrities to believe they could pivot a 1,000-year-old institution like a tech startup. Historical consensus dictates that the crown does not modernize, it simply endures, outlasting the fleeting trends of each passing century. Declassified palace briefings reveal that the Sussexes' proposals for a progressive role were viewed with a profound, authoritative skepticism by the senior courtiers who maintain the palace's inner gears. One can imagine the inner monologue of the establishment as they reviewed these Americanized manifestos, noting the total lack of understanding of constitutional gravity. The surrounding atmosphere within the private offices was not one of excitement, but of a quiet, wary resignation to the fact that the newcomers were fundamentally misreading the room. They viewed the monarchy as a platform for personal branding, whereas records from the era show the institution views branding as a sacrifice of the individual to the state. This fundamental miscalculation was the catalyst for the friction that followed, a collision between the ephemeral world of global celebrity and the permanent, unyielding structure of the royal bloodline. It is a cynical reality that those who believe they are the exception to the rule are usually the ones the 1,000-year-old trap is designed to eventually crush. The hierarchy remains untouched by their ambition, a testament to the fact that the machine is far larger than any of its temporary occupants. Flaw 4 memoirs from former senior courtiers paint a chilling picture of the physical tension that permeated the palace as the couple attempted to negotiate their unprecedented exit strategy. The Grey Men operated with a clinical precision, recognizing that to allow even a small deviation in protocol would be to invite the collapse of the entire 1,000-year-old trap. There was a profound absurdity to the Sussexes' belief that they could retain the benefits of the hierarchy while discarding its rigid, unbending rules of service. Records from the era show that every request for flexibility was met with a polite but absolute rejection, framed by the institution as a protection of the crown's sovereign integrity. One can almost hear the silent monologue of the palace staff as they observed the couple's public-facing tactics, viewing their emotional transparency as a fatal breach of the stoicism that keeps the monarchy relevant. The long-term consequences of this miscalculation were a total breakdown in trust, leaving the couple isolated in a fortress of their own making. While they spoke of liberation, the institutional archives suggest they were merely drifting further into the shadows of the royal narrative, away from the core influence they once possessed. It was a grand historical drama of a misunderstanding so profound it could only end in the clinical erasure of their official status. The surrounding atmosphere of the court during these final meetings was one of immense, professional finality, a signal that the crown's patience had reached its absolute limit. Flaw 4a as we reflect on the archival letters from the period, it becomes clear that the Sussexes' greatest error was the belief that the public's temporary fascination could serve as a shield against the institutional pressure of the palace. Historical consensus shows that the monarchy values the long game over the immediate approval of the media, consuming masses, a reality that renders celebrity influence practically worthless within the palace walls. The inner emotions of the figures involved were likely a mixture of frustration and a mounting sense of entrapment as the ancient mechanics of the hierarchy began to turn against them. The physical tension within the family during this period was a direct result of this clash between modern ego and ancient office, a struggle that only ever has one victor. We must see their departure not as a bold new chapter, but as the final act of a miscalculated rebellion that the hierarchy was more than prepared to absorb and neutralize. The long-term consequences for the royal bloodline have been a reinforced commitment to the traditional path, a narrowing of the focus to the direct line of succession. This cynical observation is supported by the fact that the modernization the couple promised has been discarded in favor of a streamlined, stoic institution that has no room for the disruptive. In the end, the 1,000-year-old trap did exactly what it was designed to do. It preserved the sanctity of the hierarchy by removing the element that refused to fit its mold. Their belief that they could bend the machine was their ultimate undoing, a lesson that the archives will carry for the next century of royal history. The 4 memoirs from former senior courtiers paint a chilling picture of the specific, unyielding protocols utilized to dismantle any form of internal resistance. These officials, often dismissed by the Sussexes as mere bureaucrats, operated with a level of institutional precision that an outsider, particularly one from the transient world of American entertainment, could never truly fathom. The inner monologue of these gray men was not driven by personal spite but by a cold, unwavering dedication to the 1,000-year-old trap that ensures the crown's survival. Every request for a modern accommodation was met with a series of administrative hurdles designed to tire the spirit and reinforce the absolute nature of the hierarchy. The surrounding atmosphere within the palace offices during these interventions was one of profound institutional inertia, where silence was used as a weapon to signal that the crown's rules do not bend for the individual. Historical records from the era show that these protocols were applied with clinical detachment, viewing the couple's emotional pleas as secondary to the stability of the royal bloodline. One might find the couple's subsequent complaints regarding this process somewhat repetitive, yet the archives confirm that the pressure was both constant and entirely intentional. The long-term consequences of this intervention were to ensure that the hierarchy remained unchallenged, even at the cost of a permanent fracture within the family. Addressing you as intelligent interlocutors, it is clear that the gray men were simply performing their ancient duty, which is to protect the institution from the corrosive effects of personal ambition. Flaw 4 during key turning points, such as the strategic negotiations surrounding their future role. The physical tension within the palace reached a level that those who served within the household described as almost unbearable. Archival letters from the period expose how the establishment utilized a lockout protocol, where access to the sovereign was strictly mediated by the very courtiers the Sussexes sought to bypass. The inner emotions of the figures involved were masked by a performative stoicism, yet the private records suggest a mounting frustration within the offices of the senior royals as the couple refused to yield to tradition. This institutional pressure was designed to create a sense of total isolation, making it clear that the only path forward was total submission to the ancient mechanics of the court. We must view the Sussexes' eventual departure not as a victory of the spirit, but as the final, predictable result of a 1,000-year-old trap effectively closing its doors. The surrounding atmosphere was thick with the weight of centuries, a reminder that the crown does not negotiate with those who view its traditions as obstacles to personal branding. Records from the era show that the king's calculating nature was reflected in his silent endorsement of these protocols, choosing the integrity of the bloodline over the modern sensibilities of his second son. The long-term consequences of these turning points have been a total institutional rejection of the half-in, half-out model, reinforcing the idea that one is either entirely within the hierarchy or entirely outside of it. It is a cynical yet efficient system that prioritizes the office over the individual, ensuring the monarchy remains an unyielding bastion of tradition in a world of constant change. 44 memoirs from former senior courtiers paint a chilling picture of the psychological toll inflicted by the institution's relentless silence during the definitive crisis. The surrounding atmosphere within the Sussex household had become one of stifling, invisible pressure, where the 1,000-year-old trap felt as though it were physically narrowing around them. Records from the era show that every request for basic human empathy or professional intervention was met with a clinical detachment that signaled the crown's absolute refusal to bend its ancient rules. One can only imagine the inner monologue of a woman used to professional independence, finding herself in a scenario where the hierarchy would rather let her drown than admit its own protocols were archaic. The physical tension within the palace corridors was described as a heavy, unyielding weight, an institutional pressure that demanded total self-effacement at the cost of personal sanity. Declassified palace briefings reveal that the Grey Men viewed this breaking point not as a tragedy, but as a necessary phase in the campaign of isolation designed to force a total submission or a final exit. There is a certain authoritative cynicism in how the establishment waited for the modern spirit to fracture against the unyielding stone of the monarchy's tradition. Skepticism regarding the Duchess's struggle within the palace was the prevailing sentiment among the senior staff, who viewed her emotional transparency as a breach of the stoicism required by the royal bloodline. This definitive crisis was not merely a private struggle but a grand historical drama where the individual was weighed against the continuity of a 1,000-year-old hierarchy and found wanting. The long-term consequences of this breaking point were to cement the fracture between the Sussexes and the institution, ensuring that the ancient mechanics of the court remained unassailable. Flaw 4, historical consensus dictates that the breaking point was reached when it became clear that the king's calculating nature prioritized the institutional image over the immediate welfare of his own family. The inner emotions of those orchestrating this quietly cruel campaign were rooted in a disciplined preservation, viewing any modern disruption as an existential threat to the sovereign's long-term standing. Archival letters from the period expose a culture where the surrounding atmosphere was dictated by the rigid application of protocol, even as the psychological weight on the outsider reached its zenith. One might view the Sussexes' subsequent public revelations with a measure of dismissive skepticism. Yet the mechanics of their displacement reveal a far darker truth about the nature of royal power. Those who served within the household noted that the physical tension during the final negotiations was a manifestation of two irreconcilable worlds: the ancient bloodline and the modern influencer. The long-term consequences for the royal bloodline have been a reinforced sense of isolationism, as the hierarchy chose to sacrifice its own members to maintain its frozen, unyielding stability. Every strategic silence and every denied request was a cog in the 1,000-year-old trap, ensuring that the outsider remained manageable through her own vulnerability. To the intelligent interlocutor, it is evident that the breaking point was the logical conclusion of a process set in motion the moment the American actress entered the fray. Records from the era show that the palace does not fear the breaking of an individual, for it knows that the crown is eternal, while its occupants are merely temporary. This final descent into total institutional rejection serves as a stark reminder that within the walls of the temple dedicated to duty, there is no room for the independent spirit. 44 archival letters from the period expose the exact moment the grand illusion of a modernized monarchy finally shattered against the unyielding stone of the 1,000-year-old hierarchy. Those who served within the household noted that the surrounding atmosphere in the palace had shifted from one of cautious observation to a cold, clinical finality as the establishment ceased its performative hospitality. The inner monologue of the Sussexes, as captured in the memoirs of those who observed them, reflects a growing, frantic realization that the crown would not, under any circumstances, adapt its ancient protocols to suit their personal ambitions. This was the point where the physical tension within the family transformed into a permanent fracture, a tectonic shift in the royal bloodline that no amount of diplomacy could mend. Historical consensus dictates that the institution's refusal to bend was not an act of cruelty, but a calculated defense of its own sovereign integrity. The skeptical language used in declassified palace briefings suggests that the senior courtiers viewed the couple's shock as a symptom of a profound, almost terminal, misunderstanding of the constitutional gravity they were attempting to bypass. By maintaining its rigid posture, the hierarchy signaled to the world that while individuals are transient, the machine remains absolute and entirely indifferent to modern sentimentality. The long-term consequences of this refusal have been a reinforced sense of traditionalism, proving that the 1,000-year-old trap remains as functional and restrictive as ever, Each sentence of this unfolding drama serves to remind the intelligent observer that the monarchy survives not by changing with the times, but by outlasting them. Flaw 4 records from the era show that the aftermath of this shattered illusion was managed with the same professional detachment that has characterized the Crown's handling of disruptors for centuries. The surrounding atmosphere of the court became one of immense institutional patience, as the Grey Men watched the Sussexes attempt to construct a rival narrative from the debris of their royal status. This cynical reality that celebrity is a poor substitute for the gravity of an ancient bloodline was noted by former senior courtiers who watched the couple's influence systematically diminish within the United Kingdom. The inner emotions of the king, framed through archival letters, suggest a monarch who had moved past paternal concern into a state of total institutional preservation. Skepticism toward the Sussexes' subsequent media ventures was the prevailing sentiment within the palace offices, where their actions were viewed as a desperate, and ultimately futile, attempt to regain the relevance the hierarchy had stripped away. The long-term consequences for public perception have been a significant hardening of the divide between those who value the unbending tradition and those who sought to dismantle it. It is a grand historical drama that reminds the intelligent interlocutor that in the game of royal chess, the crown never truly loses its position, even when it sacrifices a piece. Ultimately, the shattering of the illusion was a necessary step in the institution's self-correction, ensuring that the ancient rules remain the only currency that carries true value within the palace walls. This clinical erasure of the couple's influence was executed with a precision that left the hierarchy more secure and more isolated than ever before. 24. The public has been fed a diet of carefully managed press releases and soft, focus interviews, yet declassified palace briefings reveal a far more clinical and less sentimental reality within the sovereign's inner sanctum. While the global media focused on the emotional optics of a royal rift, the institutional archives paint a chilling picture of a hierarchy engaged in a cold-blooded assessment of brand management and damage control. Those who served within the household noted that the surrounding atmosphere during these private briefings was one of immense, silent pressure to protect the royal bloodline at any cost, regardless of the personal narratives being spun by the Sussexes in the American press. The inner monologue of the establishment was focused on the long-term survival of the thousand-year-old trap, viewing the couple's public transparency not as a virtue, but as a strategic error that necessitated their quiet erasure. Records from the era show a machinery that does not react to tabloid headlines, but to the deep, tectonic shifts in constitutional stability that the American intruder threatened to trigger. We must address the discrepancy between the People's Prince narrative and the archival reality of a senior royal who was systematically being decoupled from the core resources of the state. The skepticism regarding the Sussexes' version of events is reinforced by these records, which show that for every public expression of empathy, there was a private, institutional move designed to tighten the invisible barriers around them. The long-term consequences of this duality are visible today, as the public's perception continues to fragment while the Crown's private records remain a testament to its unyielding, cynical persistence. It is a grand historical drama where the truth is not found in the spotlight, but in the footnotes of declassified briefings that most will never see. Flaw 4 memoirs from former senior courtiers expose how the palace utilized the media as a distraction while the real work of isolation was carried out behind closed, mahogany doors. While the Sussexes were busy litigating their grievances in the court of public opinion, the archival letters from the period reveal that the Grey Men were already finalizing the logistics of their institutional departure. The surrounding atmosphere of the court was one of profound, professional silence, a void that the couple attempted to fill with increasingly desperate media maneuvers that only served to confirm the establishment's skepticism. One can imagine the inner emotions of the king, who, despite the public facade of a grieving father, was reportedly focused on the clinical preservation of the hierarchy's dignity. Physical tension within the palace increased as the gap between what was said in public and what was documented in private grew into an unbridgeable chasm. Historical consensus dictates that the crown's survival depends on this very ability to maintain a dual reality, one for the masses and one for the initiates of the bloodline. This authoritative look at the private briefings shows a monarchy that is far more calculating and less vulnerable than the struggling outsider would have the world believe. The long-term consequences for the Sussexes have been a permanent loss of credibility within the very institution they once sought to revolutionize from within. Ultimately, the records from the era show that while the public follows the drama, the crown is writing a much longer, more ruthless history. 44 The departure of the Sussexes was never the heroic escape they attempted to sell to the American television networks. Rather, it was the final, inevitable stage of a forced expulsion dictated by secret palace protocols. Archival letters from the period expose a machinery that had already moved past the point of reconciliation, viewing the couple as a structural liability that needed to be surgically removed to protect the sovereign's long-term standing. Those who served within the household noted that the exit was meticulously managed by the very courtiers the couple believed they were outsmarting, ensuring that the hierarchy remained intact while the disruptors were cast into a state of permanent, external orbit. The inner monologue of the institution during these final days was one of clinical efficiency, focusing on the removal of royal patronages and the cessation of financial support as a means to finalize the erasure. One must appreciate the slightly cynical reality that the 1,000-year-old trap did not break because they left. It simply ejected the elements it could no longer contain or control. Declassified palace briefings reveal that the king's calculating approach was to allow the narrative of a voluntary exit to persist in public, while privately ensuring that the mechanisms of the state were fully decoupled from his second son's future. The surrounding atmosphere within the palace offices was one of immense professional relief, as the bureaucracy returned to its preferred state of quiet, unyielding order. This was not a departure born of freedom, but a departure dictated by an institution that had already decided they no longer fit the grand historical drama of the royal bloodline. In the weeks leading up to their final engagements, the physical tension within the family reached its zenith, a manifestation of the total institutional pressure being applied to force a definitive choice. Memoirs from former senior courtiers paint a chilling picture of how the Sussexes' attempts to negotiate a hybrid role were met with a series of absolute, non-negotiable rejections that left them with no choice but to leave. One can imagine the inner emotions of the figures involved, caught between a desire for modern autonomy and the crushing weight of an ancient bureaucracy that views autonomy as an act of treason. The surrounding atmosphere was one of profound institutional inertia, where the gray men simply waited for the couple to realize that the rules would never bend to accommodate their celebrity aspirations. Historical consensus suggests that the palace's silence during this period was its most effective weapon, creating a vacuum that the couple attempted to fill with increasingly desperate media maneuvers. This skeptical view of their departure is reinforced by the archival records, which show that the terms of their exit were entirely dictated by the crown, leaving them with the titles but none of the true power of the hierarchy. The long-term consequences for the royal bloodline have been a reinforced sense of traditionalism, as the king has utilized the vacancy to streamline the household and focus on the direct line of succession. While the Sussexes may have believed they were leading a revolution, the records from the era show they were merely providing the gray men with an opportunity to prove that the crown is immutable. The subsequent media narrative emanating from California has been viewed by the palace hierarchy with a measure of weary, authoritative cynicism as a transparent attempt to maintain a relevance that the institution has already stripped away. Records from the era show that, as the couple leaned into the world of commercial contracts and high-gloss documentary storytelling, the palace simply continued its slow march through history, largely indifferent to the noise. The inner monologue of the establishment remains focused on the long game, knowing that the transient glitter of Hollywood is no match for the permanent gravity of an ancient bloodline. Those who served within the household noted that the surrounding atmosphere of the court today is one of reinforced boundaries, where the lessons of the Sussex departure have been used to tighten the protocols around the remaining members of the family. The physical tension that once dominated the headlines has been replaced by a clinical, professional distance, as the king has successfully neutralized the threat by allowing it to simply fade into the background of global celebrity culture. Skepticism regarding the Sussexes, freedom, is the prevailing sentiment in the private clubs of London, where the establishment notes that they are now more beholden to the whims of the market than they ever were to the protocols of the palace. The long-term consequences of this forced expulsion have been to solidify the hierarchy's power, proving that the 1,000-year-old trap is capable of surviving even the most public of fractures. Ultimately, their departure serves as a stark reminder that within the royal narrative, there are no protagonists, only servants of the crown or those who have been erased by it. The departure of the Sussexes necessitated a silent, intense recalibration of the royal bloodline, as the hierarchy sought to close the ranks that had been so publicly breached by modern individualism. Declassified palace briefings reveal that the king's strategic vision for a slimmed-down monarchy was not merely a fiscal adjustment, but a calculated effort to insulate the core of the institution from further volatility. Those who served within the household noted that the surrounding atmosphere became one of reinforced focus on the direct line, effectively sidelining any branch that refused to adhere to the ancient protocols. Historical consensus dictates that the role of the spare is inherently precarious, existing only as a secondary support system for the sovereign's direct heirs. One can imagine the inner emotions of the senior royals as they watch the Sussexes' global influence slowly detach from the institutional gravity of the crown. The physical tension that characterized the Meghan era has been replaced by a clinical, professional distance that ensures the bloodline remains untainted by the transient whims of celebrity. Records from the era show that the palace views this as a necessary correction, a return to the stoic permanence that has defined the monarchy for centuries. By recalibrating the bloodline, the king has ensured that the 1,000-year-old trap is more secure than ever, leaving the disruptors to find their own way in a landscape that values novelty over heritage. Flaw-4 archival letters from the period expose a profound determination within the senior courtiers to ensure that the disruption caused by the Sussexes is never repeated, leading to a permanent hardening of the hierarchy's defenses. There is a certain authoritative cynicism in the way the establishment now reflects on the American experiment, viewing it as a cautionary tale of the friction that arises when Hollywood ego meets constitutional duty. The inner monologue of the institution remains fixed on the long game, recognizing that the current stability was purchased at the high cost of total familial exclusion. Skepticism regarding the Sussexes' ability to maintain their cultural relevance without the prestige of the crown is a recurring theme in memoirs from former senior officials. The surrounding atmosphere of the court has transitioned into one of quiet, disciplined satisfaction that the institutional narrative has been reclaimed from the chaos of the tabloid cycle. Historical records indicate that the king's calculating nature was essential in navigating this fracture, prioritizing the office over personal sentiment to prevent a long-term decline in the monarchy's authority. This recalibration serves as a stark reminder that in the grand historical drama of the British state, the individual is always secondary to the continuity of the bloodline. Flaw-4 those who served within the household noted that the physical tension, once present in the hallways of Buckingham Palace, has been replaced by a sense of streamlined efficiency, as the Grey Men redirected resources toward the Prince and Princess of Wales. This shift in allocation was not merely a matter of logistics, but a clear signal from the hierarchy that the future of the bloodline is strictly focused on a singular, unified path. The inner emotions of the figures involved, the king, his heir, and the senior staff, appear through the lens of archival letters to be one of resolute commitment to the traditional model of service. Historical consensus suggests that by removing the Sussex noise, the institution has successfully lowered its profile in a way that paradoxically increases its long-term security. One might find the couple's exclusion somewhat cold, yet declassified briefings indicate that the palace viewed their continued presence as a brand infection that required surgical removal. The surrounding atmosphere of the royal estates today is one of reinforced boundaries, where the thousand-year-old trap has been recalibrated to be even more exclusive and less accessible to modern intruders. The long-term consequences of this strategy are a monarchy that is perhaps less vibrant, but infinitely more durable against the pressures of the digital age. Finally, the records from the era show that the king's tactical brilliance lay in his ability to allow the American woman and his son to believe they were winning a media war, while he was quietly winning the institutional war. The inner monologue of the crown was always focused on the preservation of the throne, viewing the couple's public disclosures as a temporary inconvenience that would eventually fade into the background noise of history. Skepticism toward their truth remains the dominant tone within the palace, where staff observations suggest a belief that the couple sacrificed their heritage for a fleeting moment of global notoriety. The surrounding atmosphere of the court is now one of unyielding professional order, a testament to the success of the quietly cruel campaign of isolation that began years ago. Historical records indicate that the bloodline has emerged from this crisis more insular and more protective of its ancient hierarchy than at any point in the modern era. The long-term consequences of this recalibration are a permanent change in the royal family's dynamic, where the Sussexes are no longer viewed as members of the firm, but as distant relatives whose influence is entirely theoretical. Addressing the audience as equals, we must see that the hierarchy has done what it does best. It has survived by ensuring that the thousand-year-old trap remains closed to those who refuse to follow its rules. 44 The thousand-year-old trap remains, as it always has, the silent victor in this grand historical drama. Declassified palace briefings from the transition period reveal a hierarchy that is not merely a collection of individuals, but a self-sustaining organism that views the modern world with a profound, authoritative skepticism. One must appreciate the slightly cynical reality that the American experiment was never intended to succeed within walls that were built to exclude anything that does not serve the bloodline. The inner monologue of the institution has returned to its preferred state of quiet, unyielding order, having successfully neutralized a disruption that many believed would change the monarchy forever. Those who served within the household noted that the surrounding atmosphere is now one of clinical professional satisfaction, as the rules that once sought to isolate the Sussexes have been reinforced to protect the future of the direct line. The physical tension that once gripped the palace corridors has dissipated, replaced by a cold, administrative finality that marks the definitive end of the Sussex era within the United Kingdom. Records from the era show that the king's calculating nature was the decisive factor in this preservation, proving that the crown values the office far more than the person inhabiting it. The long-term consequences of this saga are clear. The monarchy has not modernized. It has simply refined its ancient defenses against the intrusion of modern celebrity. Skepticism regarding the Sussexes' future relevance is rooted in the fact that they are now untethered from the very source of gravity that gave them their significance. We see a system that does not adapt to the world, but rather waits for the world to tire itself out against its unyielding gates. Historical consensus dictates that the British monarchy survives precisely because it possesses no human heart to be broken by the whims of the modern age. Memoirs from former senior courtiers paint a chilling picture of an establishment that views the individual's struggle as a secondary concern to the maintenance of the hierarchy's stoic image. As we examine the archival letters from this period, it becomes evident that the struggling outsider was always playing a game she was destined to lose against an opponent with a 1,000-year head start. The inner emotions of the figures involved have been filed away in the institutional archives, destined to be forgotten by a state that values continuity above all else. One might find the Sussexes' subsequent media ventures to be a somewhat tiresome postscript to a story that the hierarchy has already finished writing. The surrounding atmosphere of the court today is one of immutable tradition, a space where the independent spirit is viewed as a liability rather than an asset. Ultimately, the erasure of Meghan Markle from the central royal narrative was not an act of malice, but a clinical, institutional necessity to ensure the bloodline remains unassailable. We are left with a monarchy that is more isolated, yet perhaps more secure, in its ancient, unbending. The physical tension of the past few years has been traded for a reinforced stability that ensures the king's strategic vision for a streamlined household remains the only path forward. This unvarnished look at the mechanics of power serves as a reminder that the crown is a machine that does not possess a heart, only a set of gears that turn with a ruthless, generational logic. It is the weight of history that truly defines the palace, a weight that eventually crushes anything that refuses to find its place within the hierarchy. The grand historical drama of the American Duchess serves as a definitive case study in how the 1,000-year-old trap identifies, isolates, and eventually removes any perceived threat to the royal bloodline. We must conclude that the king's calculated indifference was not a failure of character, but the ultimate expression of his duty to the crown's permanence. The long-term consequences for those who sought to reform the institution from the outside are a slow descent into a celebrity landscape that offers none of the protection of the ancient hierarchy. Records from the era show that the palace does not feel the need to explain its methods, for its survival is the only metric of success that the gray men acknowledge. As we close this chapter of the royal story, the surrounding atmosphere of the court remains one of profound, professional silence, a void that no amount of modern publicity can ever hope to fill. The institutional pressure that broke the Sussexes remains in place, waiting for the next disruptor to test the strength of the 1,000-year-old trap. Reflecting on this saga, we see that the crown does not move toward the future. It simply forces the future to wait at its doorstep. Leave your thoughts below. I read every word you write. And if you value this unvarnished look at the monarchy, do ensure you are subscribed and share this with those who appreciate the truth.